international region of the Northeast. From then on, we had many interactions, and is it the red button I push, or that's it, there we are. And so there's the man on the right with the beard. I invited Dave in 1988 to be our traveling expert on the Centre's Atlantic Canada Faculty Institute to Newfoundland and Labrador, and here we are waiting for the ferry across to Labrador. And on that trip he regaled us with stories of how he, Sylvia, and the two kids and their beloved Land Rover drove along a dirt road up the northern peninsula of Newfoundland to see the Ingstad's excavation at Lanceau Meadows in the early 1960s. So here we are in the late 80s, and he's already sort of taking you back to that extraordinary excavation in the early 60s. Dave was there, no surprise. He also accompanied me on another institute to New Brunswick and PEI in summer of 1996. We enjoyed many conversations and beers, and I marveled at his breadth of reading and knowledge. I particularly remember meeting him at Logan sometime in the late 1990s. I just arrived on a flight from London, and Dave had also come in from the UK on a different flight. Naturally, I asked him what he'd been doing in London. Was it perhaps something to do with his recent writing about H.G. Wells? No, he told me. He'd just given a paper on volcanoes. Volcanoes, I exclaimed. What do you know about volcanoes? He then went on to explain the impact of volcanic eruption on climate change and how these eruptions affected climate in New England as revealed by farmers' diaries. It was typical Dave, the Renaissance scholar straddling the humanities and sciences. Given Dave's interest in climate and environment, as well as, of course, Maine, it should be no surprise that he was involved in the early planning for the Historical Atlas of Maine in the late 1990s. At the time, there was considerable and building interest in environmental topics. There was the environmental turn in the discipline of history, just starting in the 1990s. Dave was in the history department, he was soon to retire, but we had the newly hired forest historian, Dick Judd. And finally, the importance of natural resources to the Maine economy and the considerable scholarship in the natural science departments on the state's environment. So all of this helped shape our development of the Atlas project. So it made sense to have the environment as one of three themes in the Atlas. The other two were native peoples and resource economies and spin-offs from those economies. Well, Dave came to the early planning meetings in the late 1990s, along with the Atlas coordinator, Bert Hatland from English, the two editors, myself and Dick Judd, and faculty and colleagues that included David Sanger, George Jacobson, who's here, Hal from CCI. Dave was particularly keen to have a series of environmental plates for the post-contact period. These plates would summarize the state of climate and vegetation in the state at significant dates. Well, this proposal made it into the NEH proposal that was eventually funded in 2004. But by then, unfortunately, Dave's health was not the best. And as the Atlas began to move into gear in the early 2000s, he became less and less involved in the project. In fact, I rarely saw him on campus. As it became clear that Dave was not going to play any further role in the Atlas, responsibility for developing the climate and environment content fell on other shoulders. As many of you know, Dave passed away in 2009, and it is one of my regrets that he did not live to see the Atlas completed. I think he would have been delighted with the result. Well, how did we proceed? I'm going to start with the post-contact period and then end with the pre-contact period, as that is how we developed content for the Atlas. What became soon apparent was the dearth of readily available information on climate and the environment for the post-contact period. Apart from Dave's and David Demerit's work on farmers' diaries, there did not appear to be much on climate change and its effects on agriculture and forestry. For the environment, we had Charles Sargent's map of forest cover from the Federal Census of 1880, geographer Bob LeBlanc's map of large water power sites, and Kim Siebold's doctoral dissertation in the history department here, which had been supervised by Dave, I think the last graduate student he had, and that was on salt marshes, and we'll see that in just a minute. And then Dick Judd was starting to work on Henry David Thoreau and his travels in Maine. Well, altogether, this was pretty thin. I mean, we had sort of little islands of expertise, but nothing in the way of comprehensive coverage. Now, I'm sure you were thinking that we must have had more. There must have been more out there. What about Dave's work on the pulp and paper industry, or Richard Wood's book on the early lumber industry? These and other studies were more economic than environmental in focus. Moreover, there was a fundamental problem in that these and other works were texts, frequently illustrated with graphs, that did not translate into maps. We had an issue of representation. Historians present their data temporally, and usually in the form of a written narrative. An outstanding example from our neck of the woods here is Jeff Bolster, historian down at UNH, recent environmental history, The Mortal Sea, Fishing the Atlantic in the Age of Sail. And it's full of evidence, but very few maps showing the ecological changes. And then, as I've seen in the presentations and on the posters at the back, natural scientists commonly summarize data in a graph. But an atlas represents data spatially. And as a geographer, I was determined to make sure that maps were central to the atlas. In fact, if you look at many historical atlases done by historians, there's a lot of text, a few photographs, and maybe a map in a corner. I just was not going to have that at all. So with the material to hand, we had to do research in the available documents. And by that I mean what was available in government documents and special collections in Fogler. There was never enough money or time to travel and spend lengthy periods researching in the archives. So what did we produce? Well, there's 4 sections in the atlas, and the first section is from the end of the last ice age through to the American Revolution. So the latter part of that section is the colonial period, and we found nothing for the colonial period, absolute paucity of surviving records and a lack of any scholarly research. And Bolster's book came out years after we'd finished the atlas, so we couldn't even draw on his material. For the early 19th century, which is the second section in the atlas, we had a plate on agriculture. In fact, we have 4 plates at least, 4 or 5 plates on agriculture, but this one shows the regionalization of cereal growing, reflecting different climates in the state, so between corn and oats, which is essentially a divide along the Kennebec River between corn and non-corn areas, a division that Champlain first observed in 1604, and that has been confirmed by archaeological work, notably by Dave Sanger. In fact, years before the atlas started, Dave had told me about this fundamental divide in the state. This is Kim Siebold's marshland plate that Dave Smith and Hal were certainly involved in. I think I went on at least one field trip with them looking at marshes. This is Millbridge, and I essentially mapped out the distribution of the marshes, and then we had this sort of small example here of the Millbridge Marsh. For the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the 3rd section, we started to get into much better, richer data sources. And so here we have geographer Bob LeBlanc's work on water power sites. And I know Hal can give you a lecture on the importance of the geological structure for water power on this topic. And this, of course, was going to be crucial for the development of the textile and pulp and paper industries, the water power. I slipped in a plate on scientists surveying the state. It was my attempt to show the rise of scientific observation in the late 19th century in areas such as geology. So we've got some of the early geological, in fact, the first geological maps in the state here, and superficial geology, topographic mapping from the USGS, The effect of water pollution. This is the first survey of pollutants and incidents of typhoid in Maine rivers. We also included the Agassiz Rock at Ellsworth Falls, and in fact the text draws on Dave Smith's and Hal's paper on Louis Agassiz, The Great Deluge, an Early Maine Geology, published in the Northeastern Naturalist. We had a number of plates on extractive industries. I'm only going to show you 2 or 3 here. This was tying in vegetation, in fact, stands of hemlock shown here from Charles Sargent's map in the 1880 census, which is an attempt, the first attempt to map vegetation, I think nationally, in fact. So we just looked at the Maine data and pulled out the hemlock forest, which was going to be critical, was critical to the tanning industry. The hemlock bark was stripped off, trees were killed, and that was a sort of exhaustible resource. So that was the tanning industry. We also have a plate here on the granite and ice industries, and I well remember Mike Herman, the cartographer, working with the bedrock geology maps to create the map of the granite plutons coming here, and in the blue is the slate and granite districts of the state. So bringing in the geology into this resource economy. Hydrography we were particularly interested in, and so with the development of the mills, in fact the pulp and paper mills, we looked at the changes in the west branch of the Penobscot, the diversion of the west branch, in fact, through the new mill at Millinocket, which is all shown here, and the various drops on the dams that get put in, sort of making the point of how humans have altered the flowage within the state, particularly in the northern part of the state. I worked with a graduate student from forestry on the abandonment of farms. It's a huge issue in the Northeast in the late 19th, early 20th century, still going on really. Fortunately, we had tremendous data from the state. I think this is unique, showing abandoned farms by township, which we mapped out here. I think it's a unique map. And I remember Dave, I did this after David passed away, I think, and David observed in one of his writings that 500 feet elevation was the sort of the key. Anything above 500 feet was simply not viable for agriculture, even for raising hay in the state. And so we put on the 500-foot contour, and there's a pretty close correlation between the uplands, anything over 500 feet, and abandonment of farms. And I think you would have enjoyed this plate. It seems to have developed a bit of a life. Michael Alpert, who was putting this together for the atlas, the final design work, was met by a biologist who was working on particular hare species. Don't ask me which one in the state. And these hares proliferate in areas where the forest has been cut back. And he looked at this map and apparently was in delirium, because this essentially showed the distribution of where the hares have been in the 20th century because of the changes in the vegetation cover. So who knows how these maps can be used by other scholars. Into the 20th century, we again came back to the lumber industry and put a fair bit of work into mapping out the dams and change in flowage. So you can't really see, but there's a range of dots here, shown here, which are all the dams in the headwaters of the Penobscot. And then the lakes, which were created by the damming, and so larger lakes are created. We've got the original river flow in dark blue, and you can just see the expansion of the water body through damming. Looking out on all of you, many faculty and graduate students, huge amount of scholarship comes out of this community in this room. I have to say that many of these environmental plates, Kim Siebold, the Marshland plate, and this was done by Hans Carlson, a PhD student in history, and he did several others. That's basically it, the kind of graduate research. So I think it's quite extraordinary what particularly Hans achieved, and this was one of his plates. And then this is just a detail from Jim Atchison, my colleague in anthropology, his plate on the lobster industry, and I've just pulled out the detail really a wonderful piece of work on lobster territories, just to give you a sense that we also looked at the marine environment as best as we could, and in this case used some of Jim's maps from his lobster gangs of Maine. Then finally, in the last sort of section, we looked at preservation of land in the state. Again, this is Hans Carlson working with Dick Judd, and this is public lands. And here is the initial proposal for the North Woods, which is now, of course, being much reduced, but is now a federal park. And so we're trying to map, in about 2005, I think, this data, the extent of public lands and some of the histories of public land in the state. So that was Hans again, and then the final one here that he also worked on, again with Dick Judd, is environmental issues. It's a complicated map, this is including everything from oil spills to red tide along the coast and polluted rivers. A lot of data on this, probably the most data-rich map in the atlas, and then showing dissolved oxygen content on the Androscoggin here, and oil spills and so forth, to try and bring the story up to date and look at current environmental problems. For the pre-contact period now, we had much more, thanks to faculty in CCI. Now this was the last part of the atlas to be put together, mainly because I was confident that Dave Sanger, my colleague in anthropology, would have the material for us. And so Dave, years would go by, Dave would say, are you ready yet? I said, no, Dave, we're still working on the historical stuff. We're only in the 1700s and there's masses more to do. So the years went by and Dave, of course, retired. But fortunately, we hired Brian Robinson, and it was Brian who, right at the end of the atlas process, pulled these 4 plates together. I'm going to show you the first 3. And he also, of course, had help from Dave, he's a co-author, and Alice Kelly, particularly on this first plate. So these 4 plates that the 3 of them worked on drew on CCI research, which you're all very familiar with. The melting of the ice sheets, bottom left, I think that's Hal's work, the rise of sea level, vegetation change at George's work, and then the ice sheet map. I wanted an ice sheet map to give the reader, and remember this is an atlas being used in schools, so we wanted to give the largest story whenever we could, the context. This is Terry Hughes's map, which we redrew from his book on glaciation. It caused Mike Herman all sorts of issues, but as I'm sure you are aware, it's probably the only map that shows the thickness of the ice sheets. So we've got the gradients, the elevations on that. So Mike really wrestled to redraw that and put it in color. And then finally, Brian's work, admittedly from New Hampshire, or Massachusetts, on Bull Brook. In plate 2, we've got also Joe Kelly's work and Dan Belknap's work on sea level change, as well as, again, Brian and Dave Sanger. The map is a bit thin, and I think this gets back to my point about representation, that many of you are presenting your data in graphs, and when we've got something like Maine to work with, it produces a pretty thin map. But this was what we did for this second plate and showed this kind of cultural divide on the atlas. I think it would have been better to have more data on the map, but it just wasn't mappable data. And then the third one, which I think is Dave Sanger was the lead author on, as well as Brian, and includes work by Ron Davis and again Hal Bournes. Well, these plates in the first part of the atlas are the most explicitly concerned with climate and environment, reflecting, of course, the mission and interests of CCI. And the plates establish the environment as a theme at the beginning of the atlas, which, of course, gets addressed, as far as we could, in the post-contact plates. In fact, I was more than delighted. I was overjoyed that Brian stepped up to pull this together. I've told my anthropology colleagues this, but perhaps I'll tell all of you that it was really Brian who He came over to my house. We're neighbours on Pierce Street in Orono. He came over in the early summer, just before he went off for his field school down at Machias. We sat down at the table on the porch and sketched it out. He knew the material, and it was just a case of someone pulling it all together. And he worked up the several draft plates, and then we got them into Mike Cohen's cartographic lab. So without Brian, I'm not sure what would have happened in the first part. It's all very well to present data, but you've got to have someone who's going to design the plate and lay it out. And I really felt that the atlas started with a bang. My dread was, as we were getting towards publication, that we were going to start in 1500, which would be completely unacceptable. And I wanted to take it back into the pre-contact period. And so Brian came through, and it's really a great tribute to him, and I think probably he's only working in colour. I may be wrong, but I think he was very pleased with the beauty of the plates and seeing his data laid out this way. So I know lunch is pressing, and you've been here since about 8 a.m. So just quickly to wrap up, what lessons can we learn from this Atlas project? First, it seems easier to measure environmental change over long periods. This has been done by the CCI faculty for the pre-contact period, but for the 400 years of the contact period, the measurement of environmental change in Maine has scarcely been done by historians. They've been interested in other questions, particularly social and economic questions. Therefore, the environmental work has just not been done. Second, there is the issue, as I've alluded to, of representation. Certainly, of course, physical scientists, many of you, are measuring change for the past 400 years, particularly the onset of industrialization and the Anthropocene. But I was resistant to reproducing such graphs as the famous hockey stick graph, and from that extrapolating out, which I've already seen this morning, the effects of climate change on the state, such as changing growing season, changing vegetation cover, warming of the Gulf of Maine, and rising sea level. This was not an atlas projecting out into the future. It was a historical atlas, and so I was not going to deal with that. And I wasn't also going to have just a few graphs on a plate. We had to have some maps. We needed mappable data, and that had not appeared, or at least I was not aware of it when we were working on the atlas. Finally, qualitative information, such as is contained in many accounts of the state's environment. We have quite a good record of observations on the environment in the state, is of course difficult to map. We needed geographically bounded, preferably statistical data, and that usually came from government sources, federal and state, which generally measured economic indicators. In the 19th and for much of the 20th century, they just weren't collecting the data on environmental changes. So in sum, it's a mixed story. The Atlas presents a good summary of CCI work in Maine for the pre-contact period, provides a few insights into the environment, but not the climate. We really didn't do anything for climate for the post-contact period. Of course, I wish we had done more, but given the limited resources we had at our disposal, the meager historical records of environmental change, and the competing claims, this is what you've got to remember, that everybody else wanted a piece of the atlas to be represented, and so the environment was just one story that we were looking at. And we had to cover these other topics as well. So despite all of that, I'm pleased that we managed to do as much as we did. And perhaps it's the next generation of environmental historians who will pick up where we left off. Thank you. Any questions? Yes?
I don't think it would be immodest of you to list the 4 awards.
The American Association of Geographers gives out 2 big prizes, and one is for making geography accessible to the general public. It's called the Globe Award. We got that last year. I was very pleased about that. We got 2 awards from the Cartographic and Geographic Information Society, which covers North America, both in Canada and the US. They have several categories. Best Book and Atlas, we won that. And then we also got Best of Show. In other words, it was the best cartographic product of anything produced in North America. I hadn't quite realized the significance of this, not being a professional cartographer, but Margaret Pierce, who I'm actually working with on another project, told me, well, you just knocked National Geographic off its perch. So we were delighted. And I have to say the judges came from the National Park Service, Smithsonian, and Library of Congress. So it was about as good, it is as good as you can do. And the person from the National Park Service is Tom Patterson, who I think is an absolute genius. Many of the NPS maps you pick up, Tom Patterson's work, and to have someone like him look at the atlas was really, as I say, as good as you can get. And then we got an award for publishing excellence from the Maine Writers and Publishers Alliance, which was a great fun event down in Portland about this time last year. So we're very pleased to get this recognition. I've just heard from a faculty colleague at the University of Chicago who said, who wrote to me in an email that we perhaps set the bar too high, in fact, for other states, which was a really nice thing for him to say. So we're, of course, very pleased with it cartographically in terms of content. Thank you.
Stephen, just wanted to say, absolutely fantastic. It's a document that every single person in our institute wants to be reading, and I think it's going to provide the basis for tremendous new direction in interdisciplinary research, scholarly activity for us. Just remarkable.
Well, thanks, Paul. And I know there's a lot of grad students here, perhaps young faculty. I was once a grad student and young faculty here. And when you get to my age, you realize the importance of the generations. And of course, we've got Hal here going strong. And what you realize is that when I came here and knew nothing about the state or really the environment, you look to someone like Dave Smith to educate you. And I'm glad that our generation has kind of picked up where Dave left off, pushed it along a bit, and as Paul has just very so kindly mentioned, hopefully there'll be some of you who will take it along for the next generation. And it's very important, I think, to see scholarship in terms of generations and the long term, not just your everyday sort of problem that you're working on. So thanks very much.
So we can't let you go without a memento of the Institute. And I'd really like to thank you on behalf of the Institute, for your lead role in putting Maine's history on the map.
Can't do better than that.
Again, in the spirit of Dave Smith, I also really appreciated your stories of both the production and the outcomes of producing, and I particularly liked the hair-raising tale about the relation between forests and rabbits.
Get him off.
You should have seen that coming. Thank you very much. At this point, we're going to move on to the awards, if they are here. They will be here in just a sec, so if you need a quick break, but don't go far.
I'd like to say that the term Dan used earlier, great punter, is an oxymoron.
I disagree. Now we come to one of the very happy parts of our event, and a very difficult part. I think all of you who've been listening to the talks and looking at the posters know many outstanding presentations. It's really encouraging every year to see what outstanding students we have and what skill they have in presenting their really interesting research. So we'll start with the Best Presentation, Oral Presentation Awards. There are 3, third, second, and first. I'd like to call forward Catherine Warner, who took the 3rd place prize this year. Catherine, are you here? Congratulations. Second place is Susan Elias. And first place goes to Nicholas Richmond. Next, the Poster Award, which again I think was very difficult and in fact resulted in a tie. So we have 2 equal awardees. First is Jill Pelton. And second is Mario Williams. Next up is the Dan and Betty Churchill Exploration Award. And once again, we have a tie. Carl Tugend. And Annie Santamant. Our final award is the Student Outstanding Service Award, which goes to Kimberly Miner. And so, as we come to the end of this year's Bourne Symposium, I'd like to finish by thanking the many people involved. Without Betty and Becky, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't have an event, we wouldn't have food, we wouldn't have awards or anything else, so I think we should give them a very large round of applause. We also certainly owe thanks to Paul for his leadership and for his opening remarks that gave us a way forward and some optimism for the future in these somewhat dark times. We need to thank both of our guest speakers. I'm not sure Gordon is here, but Stephen may still be with us. Yes, you are. So once again, we would not have had awards, as I said, a very difficult process of choosing among so many outstanding speakers and poster makers without our great judging committee this year for presentations and for posters, Carl Kreutz, Jasmine Saros, and Greg Zaro. And for the Churchill, Paul Majewski, Carl Kreutz, and myself. Finally, it's everybody here and everybody particularly who presented over the last 2 days who made this institute as successful and really inspiring as it is, certainly inspiring to me listening to all of you. So to all the participants, thank you very, very much. It's no accident that we are a signature program at this campus, and this could be measured in many ways. I was talking to Paul, and it's one of the many indicators, Next year on campus, there will be, across the entire campus, I believe, 7 National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowships. That is a campus record. 5 of them are related to CCI. Thank you all again. I believe lunch, is lunch ready? Lunch is ready? Welcome to the lunch.